At 2:17 this afternoon, Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell issued a statement never issued in the 110-year history of the Federal Reserve System. Quote, the Federal Reserve will not comply with Executive Order 12127, directing immediate lowering of interest rates to 0%. This order exceeds presidential authority and violates Federal Reserve independence established by the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. The Fed will continue monetary policy based on economic data, not political directive. Within 47 minutes, the Dow Jones Industrial Average plunged 847 points. The S&P 500 fell 3.2%. The Nasdaq dropped 4.1%. At 3:04 p.m., the New York Stock Exchange activated emergency trading halts for the first time since March 2020. Subscribe to this channel immediately, because what you are witnessing is not a policy disagreement between the executive branch and the Federal Reserve. This is the first direct constitutional confrontation over monetary authority since President Franklin Roosevelt's gold seizure in 1933. Turn on notifications, set them to all, because the constitutional crisis that began 72 hours ago when the president invoked emergency powers to control inflation has now escalated to institutional warfare between the presidency and the independent Federal Reserve System. Here's what happened during the 47 minutes between Powell's refusal and market collapse, because the timeline reveals how financial markets react to constitutional uncertainty. At 2:17 p.m., Powell released the statement through Federal Reserve Board's official channels. The statement was not coordinated with Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, who learned of it from news reports. At 2:23 p.m., 6 minutes after Powell's announcement, algorithmic trading systems detected the unprecedented nature of Fed defiance and began massive sell orders. At 2:34 p.m., the president responded via social media. Jerome Powell has violated his oath and betrayed the American people. The Federal Reserve works for America, not for Wall Street. I have the authority to direct monetary policy during national emergencies. Powell is fired effective immediately. But here's the constitutional problem. The president cannot simply fire the Federal Reserve chairman. The Federal Reserve Act requires cause and formal removal process. Powell serves a 4-year term that does not expire until 2026. The president appointed him, but appointment does not equal unlimited control. Hit that like button right now if you understand what just happened. The president just attempted to fire the Fed chairman for refusing a direct order, but the law does not give him that power. The algorithm decides what breaks through. You decide whether this analysis reaches people who need to see it. At 2:41 p.m., Treasury Secretary Yellen issued her own statement. The Federal Reserve operates independently within government, not independent of government. Chairman Powell's refusal to implement presidential directive during declared economic emergency raises questions about balance between Fed independence and executive authority. That statement is significant. Yellen is not supporting Powell. She is not supporting the president. She is acknowledging constitutional ambiguity. At 2:47 p.m., House Speaker Mike Johnson called Powell's refusal unprecedented usurpation of executive authority during national crisis. At 2:52 p.m., Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer responded, Fed independence is fundamental to economic stability. Presidential attempts to control monetary policy directly threaten the separation of powers that protects our economy from political manipulation. Battle lines are drawn, Republicans supporting presidential authority, Democrats defending Fed independence, and financial markets caught between competing claims of constitutional authority. At 3:04 p.m., the New York Stock Exchange triggered the first circuit breaker, halting trading for 15 minutes when the S&P 500 fell 7%. When trading resumed at 3:19 p.m., selling intensified. VIX volatility index spiked to 34.7, highest level since Silicon Valley Bank collapse in March 2023. Drop a comment right now. Tell me whether you think the president has the authority to direct Fed policy during emergencies. I am reading every response because this question will determine whether the Federal Reserve remains independent or becomes another executive department. At 3:47 p.m., 3 Federal Reserve regional bank presidents issued a joint statement supporting Powell. The presidents of New York, San Francisco, and Chicago Fed banks stated, the Federal Open Market Committee operates under statutory authority that cannot be overridden by executive order. We stand with Chairman Powell in maintaining Fed independence. But at 4:02 p.m., the president escalated. Executive Order 14128 was signed, directing the Treasury Department to assume temporary control of Federal Reserve operations under emergency authority. The order states that during declared economic emergencies, the executive branch has constitutional responsibility to direct all government economic policy, including monetary policy. That order creates deepest constitutional crisis over economic authority since Supreme Court struck down New Deal programs in 1935. Federal Reserve is simultaneously independent and part of government. President has emergency powers, but those powers have limits, and no court has ever ruled on whether emergency authority can override Fed independence. Subscribe to this channel right now if you have not already, because what I am about to show you is the legal and practical battle over who controls American monetary policy during crisis. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 created the Fed as independent agency within government. The key phrase is independent within government. The Fed is not independent of government like a private corporation. It is independent within government like the Supreme Court. The president appoints Fed governors but cannot direct their decisions. But the president also has constitutional authority as chief executive during emergencies. Article 2 gives the president power to execute laws faithfully. The question is whether Fed independence limits that emergency authority or whether emergency authority overrides Fed independence. At 4:23 p.m., the Federal Reserve Board of Governors held emergency meeting. 7 governors, all appointed by presidents, faced the question of whether to comply with presidential directive or maintain independence. According to sources, the vote was 4-3 to support Powell and refuse presidential control. 3 governors willing to comply with presidential authority were Christopher Waller, Michelle Bowman, and Philip Jefferson. The 4 supporting Powell were Lisa Cook, Adriana Kugler, Michael Barr, and Powell himself. That 4-3 split means Fed board is divided, but the majority supports independence. Here's the mathematics that determines who controls American monetary policy right now. 7 Fed governors, 4 supporting independence, 3 supporting presidential authority. But the Federal Open Market Committee that sets interest rates has 12 voting members, 7 governors plus 5 regional bank presidents. If all 5 regional bank presidents support Powell, that is 9-3 for independence. If even 2 regional bank presidents support presidential authority, vote becomes 7-5 for independence, still maintaining Fed independence, but with dangerously narrow margin. At 5:07 p.m., Powell announced he would convene emergency Federal Open Market Committee meeting for tomorrow at 8 a.m. The question is simple. Does the FOMC comply with presidential directive to cut rates to 0, or does it maintain independence and set policy based on economic analysis? Here are the 6 indicators we are watching over the next 24 hours that will determine whether Fed independence survives or whether the president gains control of monetary policy. Indicator 1, do any Fed governors change their position overnight? If one of the 4 supporting Powell switches to presidential authority, the Fed board becomes 4-3 for compliance. That would signal Fed independence cracking under presidential pressure. Indicator 2, do regional bank presidents unanimously support Powell or do some side with presidential authority? Regional bank presidents are not appointed by the president. They are chosen by regional bank boards, but they face enormous political pressure. If any break with Powell, it weakens Fed independence. Indicator 3, does Congress take any action to clarify Fed authority versus presidential emergency powers? The House could pass resolution supporting presidential authority. The Senate could pass resolution defending Fed independence. Congressional action would provide political cover for whichever position Congress supports. Indicator 4, do financial markets stabilize or continue falling? If markets interpret Fed defiance as economic chaos, political pressure on Powell increases. If markets interpret presidential control as dangerous politicization, pressure on the president increases. Indicator 5, does any federal court issue injunction on the presidential order directing Treasury control of Fed operations? Courts rarely intervene in separation of powers disputes, but unprecedented executive control of Fed might trigger judicial review. Indicator 6, do foreign central banks or international financial institutions make statements about American monetary policy independence? If European Central Bank or Bank of Japan express concern about Fed politicization, it adds international pressure to maintain independence. Here are the 3 scenarios for how this constitutional battle resolves. Scenario 1, Fed independence prevails. The FOMC votes 9-3 or 8-4 to maintain current monetary policy and reject presidential directive. Powell keeps his job. The president's emergency order is effectively ignored. Congress passes bipartisan resolution defending Fed independence. Markets stabilize. The constitutional principle that monetary policy remains independent of direct political control is reinforced. This is the institutional stability scenario where existing structures hold against executive pressure. Scenario 2, presidential authority wins. Fed board splits 4-3 for compliance after one governor switches overnight. FOMC votes 7-5 to implement presidential directive. Interest rates go to 0. Powell resigns in protest. The president appoints new chairman willing to follow executive guidance. Congress remains divided. Markets fluctuate wildly. The precedent is established that emergency powers can override Fed independence. Future presidents can control monetary policy during any declared emergency. This is the executive dominance scenario where crisis authority expands permanently. Scenario 3, constitutional deadlock. Fed refuses to comply. The president refuses to withdraw order. Treasury attempts to assume Fed operations, but Fed staff resist. Some banks follow Fed guidance, others follow Treasury orders. The financial system splits between competing authorities. Congress cannot agree on resolution. Courts refuse to intervene quickly. Markets crash further as uncertainty about who controls monetary policy creates chaos. This is the system breakdown scenario where competing constitutional claims paralyze economic policy. Subscribe right now, like this video, comment with your prediction. Which scenario happens? I am tracking all three, and when the FOMC meets tomorrow morning, you will see the analysis here immediately. Let me show you the historical significance. In 110 years since the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, no president has directly ordered the Fed to change interest rates, and no Fed chairman has publicly refused presidential directive. Presidents have pressured Fed chairs privately. They have criticized Fed policy publicly, but they have never issued executive orders commanding specific monetary policy actions. The closest precedent was President Nixon pressuring Fed Chairman Arthur Burns in 1970s to keep rates low before 1972 election. But that was private pressure, not public orders. And Burns eventually complied. Powell is the first Fed chairman to publicly refuse presidential authority. This matters because it establishes whether Fed independence is real or symbolic. If Powell can be forced to comply through presidential orders, then Fed independence exists only when the president chooses to respect it. If Powell successfully maintains independence, then Fed remains truly independent even during crises. What I know for certain right now, at 2:17 p.m., Fed Chairman Powell refused presidential order to cut rates to zero. At 3:04 p.m., markets crashed and trading halts activated. At 4:02 p.m., President ordered Treasury to assume Fed control. At 5:07 p.m., Powell called emergency FOMC meeting for tomorrow. Federal Reserve Board split 4-3 to support independence. The question is whether 12-member FOMC maintains that independence or complies with executive authority. This is constitutional separation of powers at maximum tension. The president claims emergency authority over all economic policy. Fed claims statutory independence from direct political control. Financial markets are caught between competing authorities. And tomorrow morning's FOMC meeting will determine whether American monetary policy remains independent or becomes subject to presidential directive during emergencies. The answer affects every interest rate, every investment, every loan in America. If Fed independence falls, every future economic crisis becomes opportunity for presidents to control monetary policy for political advantage. If Fed independence holds, the precedent protects monetary policy from political manipulation even during genuine emergencies. Stay with this channel, turn on notifications. When FOMC meets at 8 a.m. tomorrow, when the vote happens, when we learn whether Fed independence survived its greatest test since 1913, you will see analysis here immediately. This is not over. This is American economic constitutional structure being tested to its limits.